A reminder that abstracts are due this week for the symposium. Please keep in mind that you will receive feedback on the abstract that you submit, but the abstract remains editable, so it does not have to be a perfect, super polished thing. It is important that you get it submitted on time. It's more important that you get it submitted on time this week rather than it be sort of perfect. Yeah.
Is the 200 word limit, is that like a hard limit, or can you go below that?
If you see the website, the guidance is 150 to 250 words, an average around 200. Generally, I would say if you're significantly below that, if you're like 80 words, which we've seen some of those before, we're going to ask you to add more detail. More importantly, is if you're over the 250, we're going to tell you to cut it.
Thank you.
Other questions? All right, so please, again, those are due by the 2nd, ideally. If you can get them in by midday, no later than about 4. The reason being that we need to assign them reviewers in the system. When we had originally marked July 1st, but then last year was July 2nd, and accidentally forgot to change the date on some of the things that we announced out. Because July 3rd this year is the actual federal holiday. So I really need to assign those for review before leaving on the 2nd, so please try and get those in early again. As long as it's in there, I can assign it for review. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to review it right away, so you can continue to edit it by logging in. And it's more important that your submission is on time, or a submission is on time to assign reviewing, than it is for it to be in its final form, because it remains editable to you just by logging in, going to the upper right corner on the site, clicking on your icon that has your initial or your face that you put in there, and then selecting My Submissions and going to edit it. It will remain editable all the way up until after you receive feedback back from us on or around the 9th or 10th. We will remain editable, and then we'll transition over to the submission site for you to upload your recorded presentation. And at that point, you can still edit it, but you can't edit it without uploading the presentation, as those will be tied together at the final stage. So it really does remain editable for you up until the 16th. All right, so today we're going to talk about research ethics. Ironically, I was on a Zoom call yesterday working with a group where we're talking about how do we incorporate ethical practice of research into course-based undergraduate research. And one of the things that we were struggling with is, it was one of the groups, the way they had sort of set up the framework, was based on this idea of ethics as sort of a discrete step along the pathway of teaching you how to do research as undergraduates. And we were really struggling because really there are ethical implications at every single step of the research process and research cycle. And those look a little different. And when you try to treat it as a step instead of a theme that sort of runs throughout, it was getting really awkward, right? So we're not going to be able to talk about ethics in all sort of aspects today, but we're going to touch on some key things and give you some case studies, an opportunity to kind of explore some of these topics and think through it. But I'm going to give you a little bit of information first, in case maybe you haven't thought about this as much. I must have clicked off. I was like, it was. I checked to make sure the remote was working, but I think I must have clicked off the slide. There we go. So when we think about ethics first, right, it comes from the Greek ethos. And if you look at that, it really refers to customs, conduct, or character. Okay? So this is really about thinking about what are the customs, what are the things that we have come to as a culture believe as acceptable behaviors. Okay? That means that it shifts and changes over time and is somewhat open to interpretation, right? Because it's around values and morals, right? And some of us may have very different core values, which means that we approach some of this a little bit differently. Right? But as a society, we define this as a desirable or appropriate outcome. Yeah. So, again, word cloud up here kind of shows you some of the things that people associate with this, right? Which include standards, integrity, confidentiality, professionalism, right? A lot of different terms that we hear thrown around, right? That can mean a lot of different things to different people. Okay? So, I'm curious for you, when we talk about ethics in research, which oftentimes we refer to it as the responsible conduct of research, When you read that or you hear that, what does that mean to you?
I think a lot of our experience with that, like in a classroom setting, is integrity of your data reporting and your methods and your rapid conclusions.
Okay, so integrity of the data, integrity of what you report, integrity of the methods. All right. What else?
If you have any people that are participating in helping to give you results, confidentiality is important.
Okay, so you talked about confidentiality of participants, right? So people are helping you find your results. If you want them to be open, honest, transparent, right? That's where confidentiality is a key critical component, right? You don't want people to feel like they're at risk for participating in your study. This is the hand over here. Any other thoughts? So we talked about people generally. Are there any other things that can be involved in our research that we might need to be concerned about?
Sure, animals eventually are treated well.
Okay, so animals, right, the ones who can't speak up for themselves, right, make sure they're treated well. Anything else?
As AI becomes more of a factor, I'm sure separate journals have their own guidelines on how you disclose AI use. That's something we're working on.
All right, so AI comes up, right? So this is really something that is not very well defined right now, right? So as you mentioned, separate journals may have separate guidelines or different guidelines on what is appropriate use of AI, right? And this is one of those things where we're at the cutting edge, the front edge of technology and human interactions and interface, right? And what does that mean? How do we use it, right? All of those kinds of things in terms of how it's represented are also critical. So this is just kind of a starting point, a starting list, right? So if we think about research and ethics, we see RCR, which is the acronym for Responsible Conduct of Research, here in the center of the image on the right. And what you can see out from RCR includes data management, animal welfare, so some of the things that you guys mentioned, protection of human subjects as well. But things that we didn't talk about, conflicts of interest. What does it mean to have a conflict of interest?
If you're researching something and you might have external motives to change your data in order to see results.
Okay, so if you have a motivation to get a particular result, right? We talk about changing the data, skewing the data, and we see this particularly with corporate funders who fund research to get a specific outcome, right? We've seen history of this, particularly in the tobacco industry, right? This was publicized very broadly in the late 80s, early 90s, that they were funding people to say that smoking tobacco was healthy, okay? And they would only accept those results, right? And then funding was contingent on that, right? Imagine the pressure that puts on the person, right? If you are running a research space, you are paying people, right? Your livelihood, your payment, their livelihoods, their ability to put food on the table is dependent on you meeting these criteria of your funder, right? So conflicts of interest, right? What is that conflict that exists there? Another example might be that you are researching a drug that is potentially getting patented. There's a patent application for a company and you own stock in that company, right? So you have a tremendous financial gain from that drug, right, actually being approved. Collaboration and mentorship, right, and authorship. I've kind of put some of these together, right, because how you work with, how you interact with others makes a world of difference. Peer review, and then this kind of general concept of research misconduct, right? We're going to come back to research misconduct in a moment, but I want to talk about mentoring a little bit. And over here on the left, I have some steps here that are thinking about ethics in terms of understanding research and mentoring. And so this list, I know it's kind of hard for you to see, especially in the back. It says safety, authenticity, trust, collaboration, and values. Okay? So safety, authenticity, trust, collaboration, and values. So when we think about mentoring and collaboration and working within a community, right? Ethics and that sort of idea of sort of a cultural or a custom norm, right? When we think about these pieces here, right? How does a mentoring environment create safety? How do you feel safe in that environment to be yourself, right? To not feel like you have to achieve a certain outcome or that you have to meet a certain requirement to sort of retain employment or things like that, right? What is that authenticity? How do you bring that to the table? How is that there to make you feel comfortable, right? Make you feel like what you're doing is valued. Right? That builds trust, right? When you have safety and authenticity in a space, right, you can build trust, and that allows effective collaboration, right, which is a two-way form of communication around those shared values, right? It makes you feel comfortable because you know that your values align with the space that you're in and the people that you're working with, right? And so when we put all of these together, right, this is really critical in thinking about how mentorship is impacting the responsible conduct of research, right? Creating an environment where we feel safe to have integrity, professionalism, be authentic, right, and do the research in its quote-unquote purest form. Does that make sense? Questions? All right, I'm gonna go over here for a second. There we go. Okay, so let's talk about some of the domains in research and ethics. And it comes down to sort of three basic questions. Is it true, is it fair, and is it wise? Right? The is it true, this comes back to the research misconduct on the last page, which I said I would get into. And so that is it true comes down to integrity. And so we have falsification, fabrication, manipulation, biases. Right? These are some of the biggest, oftentimes the big three in terms of research misconduct are considered falsification, fabrication, and plagiarism. So let's kind of talk through these. What is falsification? What does that mean? Do we have an idea?
I see this a lot in, at least with like chemistry memes, where people will fake their lab data so they can go home faster.
Okay, what do you mean by fake the data?
They will make up values that seem close enough to a realistic value that they might find in their labs.
Okay, so when you say, so I want to distinguish between, I'm working towards a reason I asked for clarification, so I want to distinguish between falsification and fabrication, right? And you're using the word make up, right? And so there's a critical difference in these two, right? They could both involve made up data. There's a critical difference between falsification and fabrication. I want to see if we can get to that.
Falsification is just like skewing what you got. Fabrication is making up what you got. What you got. I guess I made up what you get, but you just put numbers in there or whatever it may be for your study. You just kind of make it up.
Okay, so you're on the right track, right? So skewing versus making it up, but you still use this word about like what you got. Okay? And that's actually going to be critical for our distinguishing. Any other thoughts on this one?
With falsification, maybe you have an outlier in your data set, you alter it to make your data set prettier.
Okay, so that's a good example, right? Taking an outlier, throwing it out without actually doing the statistical analysis to determine that, right? Because I got a gut feeling that I don't think that's right? It doesn't look like the rest of it, so I must have made a mistake. I'm just going to throw it out and ignore it. That's falsification. The critical difference between falsification and fabrication, and you all kind of touched on it, is in falsification you are actually doing the experiment. You are actually doing something. And you don't like the results, so you modify the results. So that could be making up some numbers, that could be throwing out some outliers, that could be adjusting or manipulating the data in some way. But in fabrication, you never even did it in the first place. You just completely made it up. You never did the work, you never did the experiment, you never did the survey, you just made it up. Okay? So they are defined a little bit differently, right? And some people do view them a little bit differently. Right? I'll give you an example from my own past. When I was a graduate student, I was working on this large data set. I was trying to get towards my dissertation. and trying to get it finished up. And I was trying to work on this data set, and I was getting frustrated because I just felt like the story was there, all the pieces were falling into place, but it wasn't statistically significant. And I was frustrated because I'd done one more experiment. If I added one more, it would be statistically significant. And I was disappointed. I was just kind of sitting there dejected. And a colleague of mine, another grad student, came in. And he's like, "What's the matter?" And I was like, "Well, I really thought that this replicate was going to be the one. I thought it was going to be statistically significant. It's still not there. My p-value is 0.049 or something like that. And it's just not, what I hoped it for." And he's like, "Oh, here." He goes in, he types a little bit around. He's like, "There. Now your p-value is 0.01. I said, "What did you do?" He's like, "I just changed the statistical test." So what statistical test are you using? And he's like, "Oh, well, I'm using this one. We use this one in my lab all the time." So this is, of course, before the days of Google, right? So I'd go to the library, get out a statistics textbook, and try and figure out what the difference was between the statistical tests. And the difference was, is I was using a statistical test that assumed that the data were normal. It was what's called a parametric statistical test. So if you've taken college statistics, most of you have learned things like the chi-square, the ANOVA, the student's t-test, things like this, assumes that the data comes out in a bell curve. That's what I had, right? I had data that came out in a bell curve. The statistical test he chose was a non-parametrical statistical test, which assumes that the data are not normally distributed. Usually is used for ranking ranks and other things like that, and it totally changes the analysis. But it's the two statistical tests are based on two different assumptions for the data, and only one is correct to use for the experimental design that I was using. But he's like, "Oh, well, it's statistically significant now. It solves your problem." It's like his process. I'm like, no, that's not how that works. Let's talk about that. So that would be an example of falsification, but with the best intentions, right? I'm trying to solve a problem, right? I'm not changing the data, I'm not manipulating the data, but I'm doing the wrong analysis. As opposed to fabrication, right? Also, when I was a graduate student, I was trying to generate T cells, and I was complaining to my boss, getting frustrated, can't do it. We called up this guy, he's been doing this for a long time, and he was like, "Oh, well, why are you trying to do it in June? You can never generate T cells in June." Are you freaking kidding me? And so we started talking to him, we started talking about the postdoc that had generated the data, he could never get it to work in the summer, da 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 da. Okay, we'll try again. Guy calls my boss a couple months later and says, "We need to have a conversation. I'm going to have to retract that paper. We found that the postdoc was making up all the data." He wasn't actually doing the work. When we had another grad student come in to train with him because he was going to because he'd gone to an industry job, and we called him up and asked for some help, and he's like, "Well, I can come back and help you out. I can train the grad student." They're not even fired by the industry job. Came back and the grad student caught him, basically just pretending to do something at the last day, setting up a bunch of tubes that he spiked with the right amount of sample to put in to get the results. So the computer spit out what he wanted. He wasn't actually doing an experiment, wasn't actually doing the work. Ultimately, it cost him, obviously not his job, but the guy that we were talking to was like, "Well, yeah, so he'd been a grad student in the lab, and we're in the process of trying to revoke his PhD." So these are big issues. Okay? And there are smaller issues, right? Maybe manipulation or maybe even biases. Sometimes we're not even aware of some of our biases, right? But it affects how we collect and interpret the data. Second question is it fair? This is where collegiality, human subjects, animal welfare, institutional integrity, conflicts of interest, these kinds of things come in. But you also see plagiarism, which I said was the last of the big three, right? Fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism. What does plagiarism mean? How would we define plagiarism?
Taking a work that isn't yours and copying it and claiming that it is yours.
Exactly right. They're taking somebody else's work and claiming it's yours. Okay? This is where AI creates a whole new set of challenges, right? Because even using AI to refine some of our writing, even using AI to brainstorm, right? It's not very good at providing references. It's not very good at using resources when AI hallucinates. Right? AI also plagiarizes because it pulls language directly from text, right? That's available. And therefore, we can inadvertently do it without even realizing. So making sure that you're giving credit for other people's ideas, right, is really important. This is why it's important for many of you, probably this summer, doing a thorough literature review. Citing your references, keeping track of it. Again, there can be lots of unintentional plagiarism, right? How do you manage your resources? So really recommend, if you are not already using a bibliographic software source, something like Zotero, EndNote, Mendeley, something like that, where you can help keep track of your papers and your citations. It really makes life a lot easier for you, and strongly encourage you to consider those things so you can avoid even accidental situations like this. And the last one is it wise? And I would argue, as researchers as a whole, this is the one that we are probably the worst at. I always say this in particular in terms of research is, we oftentimes ask, can we? We don't very often ask, should we? And the best example I can give you from a situation like this is in the early 1990s. We didn't know a lot necessarily back then. We were learning a lot about microbiology. We were still learning about antibiotic resistance and how it worked. We were still learning a lot about the immune system and how it functioned. One group in Australia had this really great idea. They had done this experiment where they looked at what immune hormones popped up in response to a viral infection. And so they thought, okay, we can take this virus that is relatively harmless, like an adenovirus that was relatively harmless to start with, take this virus, and we add the immune hormone that we see that's turning on the immune system. What we can do is we can use this to create vaccines. We can use recombinant DNA, or this ability to take a gene from something else and put it in an environment, to create this genetically modified organism, and that can help us accelerate vaccine development, because what we're doing is we're triggering the immune system to say, hey, this is a problem, come respond, accelerate faster, and the vaccines will be more effective. The problem is their time point was off, and the hormone that they saw that peaked is actually a hormone that turns the immune system off once it's turned on, so that you don't just become a boulder rolling down and turn into a giant inflammation and die, right, after every illness. And so when they put it in the virus, they took a relatively innocuous virus and made it 100% lethal. Now researchers are faced with a very critical question. Do I publish what I just found? Because if I do, I am giving a recipe for anyone to make an unstoppable bioterroristic weapon. But if I don't, somebody else can make the same mistake that I did, and we contained it, and what if they can't? Because everything that we did sounded logical at the time we did it. And it actually took about 4 or 5 years of negotiations back and forth to come to a decision. They ultimately decided on publishing the data with incomplete methods. Now, we are in a world today where most of us could do those methods now on our kitchen counter. But in the 90s, we couldn't. So now we've created a very different risk, right? But we've also protected people along the way who could have made the same mistake. But again, this is one of those things where best intentions, but did we know enough to know whether it was a wise decision, or did we stop to ask whether we should do that at the time we did it? And now it's created new challenges. This is why I say research ethics is constantly evolving, and what it looks like is going to change. So I'm going to quickly go through a couple things here and get to case studies. So one of us I want to talk about the differences in sources. Right, so we talk about plagiarism and ideas. One of the big things to know is the difference between a primary and a secondary source. Could anybody give a definition of a primary versus a secondary source?
In the STEM context, the primary source would be like a research article that the publishers of the paper are the ones that actually did the experimentation. then secondary source would be like a review article that reviews several of the primary sources.
Okay, so good context here, in scientific setting, primary sources have data, secondary sources don't, they summarize others' work. Outside of sciences, it's still very similar, right? So if I'm looking at the actual letters that Thomas Jefferson wrote, that's a primary source. If I'm reading a book where somebody is talking about their ideas and thoughts about what Thomas Jefferson wrote, that's a secondary resource. The problem with secondary resources is people are pulling together multiple things, right? They're pulling together multiple letters from Thomas Jefferson, or they're pulling together multiple different experiments and trying to synthesize from that. And sometimes those ideas are wrong. So you encounter this all the time. My students would come to me in my research lab, they propose a project, and I'd be like, where did you get that idea? And they're like, oh, I read this article. Just show me that article. I've never heard of this before. And they would show me a secondary article, and I would be like, okay, that's a review. Let's go back. You need to go back and look at the primary data. And sometimes a secondary article where actually cited another review for the idea. And then that review cite another review, and you get to that review, and that was their synthesis idea that they made up, and there is no primary data to support the idea. Didn't happen too often, but it did happen on occasion, right? So being really careful about understanding what is actual data, how we make conclusions, right, from those primary sources versus what we can use secondary sources for, and how we cite them. My students used to drive them crazy, but like to sort of drive this home as a point, right? I am a molecular biologist, we would run protein gels all the time, and I would make them cite Lemley's 1953 article on how to pour a protein gel. And we actually got an article returned one time saying you shouldn't be citing things more than 10 years old. And I said, no. And I argued with the editor. I said, no, we should be citing the primary sources. Always. So thinking about how you use your evidence, how you organize your evidence, how you critically analyze it and think about what it can tell you is really critical in maintaining your responsible conduct of research. So this is just kind of a general statement about plagiarism. Again, reminding you that plagiarism, right, undermines the discipline. When you take credit for somebody else's work, and this is particularly a warning with AI as we move forward, right? There are lots of situations where academics have lost their degrees, have lost their jobs because of plagiarism. So you really do want to be careful. Nobody is ever going to critique you for oversighting. Right? Let me say that. Nobody is ever going to critique you for oversighting. But there are lots of consequences if you undercite. Okay? So just kind of keep that in mind. So one of the last pieces I want to talk about before we move on is about peer review. Right? What is peer review? Does anybody have an idea or a concept of what this means in research?
When research is conducted and published, they will get sent to like a board of trustees or a board of like professionals in the field to make sure that it aligns with stuff that they know. So,
Yes, that's a pretty good description. This idea that when research is done, that it is sent to other experts to make sure that it aligns and is consistent with what's already known in the field. And in fact, it's even before the research is done, when the research is proposed. If you write for a federal grant, it will go out to peer review. Right? They will make funding decisions unless the new OMB guidance is passed. They will make funding decisions based on the peer review. So that's to make sure that your ideas aren't crazy, right? Make sure that somebody is asking all those questions. Is it right? Is it fair, right? Should we be doing this? Has this been falsified, fabricated? Is it consistent with primary data? Has it been plagiarized? All of these kinds of questions. It's a check on our work. We use it for funding proposals. We use it for papers. We use it for book chapters. Right? Isn't it? Where our colleagues are checking our work. And if we're involved in the field, we should be checking our colleagues' work. Right? To make sure, right, this is a way to maintain integrity in research. That makes it really important. There are some challenges to it, right? It also means that ideas that are a little outside the box may not get promoted, right, in the same way. Right? Because if you think about things a little differently than your peers do, It can be harder to get your research funded. It can be harder to get your research published, right, if they don't agree with you. Creates opportunity for bias to creep in. Somebody, I think you earlier mentioned about memes, right? There's always the meme about reviewer number 2, right? When you send something off, whether it's a grant, a paper, whatever, you typically get 3 reviews back, and it's always the SHIT sandwich. Right? Reviewer number 1 is usually the constructive and positive. Reviewer number 2 is the one who's high on crack, right? And telling you that your research is worthless and you are worthless. And then reviewer number 3 is usually like either really positive or like somewhere in between to kind of make you feel good at the end. So there's lots of memes about reviewer number 2. We talk about that in terms of building resiliency in students, right? How do you take and receive feedback? How do you give feedback? Right? Think about how you give it professionally. I'm currently in the process of reviewing paper. I am reviewer number 2, by the way, on this paper. Right? The first reviewers were like, I think it's good, go ahead and publish it. And I was like, no, this does not really advance the scholarship in the discipline. There are significant flaws in the work that I have concerns about. How do you present that professionally? How do you use that feedback? Right? But there are challenges in that. Some of you may have heard about, I guess now, maybe you haven't heard, because I guess now it's actually been almost a decade. It feels like it was just yesterday. There was a huge controversy that resulted in about 400 paper retractions from some of the biggest journals around the country because a group of researchers were creating fake LinkedIn identities for researchers with Gmail email accounts as they proliferated. And then when you submit something, you can suggest reviewers. And the editors were taking the shortcut of just grabbing the suggested reviewers, sending the email, and say, by looking up the person on LinkedIn, going, yeah, this looks good, but not going to the university page to verify that that's where they were employed, etc. Sending it out for review, and it was the author who was getting the email, reviewing their own work, saying it was great, sending it back, and was fast-tracking publications. And it was some of the most prestigious universities around the world were caught up in this. Some very big names that have received significant federal funds and from different countries' governments. Right? And eventually it was blown open by a journalist, right, doing the work, actually looking up LinkedIn and then looking at some of these LinkedIn profiles of these scientists and then going to the university sites and finding out that they don't actually exist. So there are some challenges to peer review, right? But by and large, it is the single way in which we can sort of maintain this sense of ethics within our community, make sure that the work is consistent with that. So I do want to touch on, before we leave, talk about that mentor responsibilities, right? Because you are undergraduates. You may not be at this level of dealing with some of these things in ethics. But what you should be encountering is a positive environment, right? One that is conducive for your learning and conducive for you to understanding responsible conduct of research. And so mentoring is a critical factor in RCR because creating that supportive environment that is collaborative, where students are treated equally, where there's supervision and review that is guiding and checking the work but not sort of micromanaging and overlooking, and helping you build independence that allows you to transition to being you and seeing yourself as a researcher, which includes presenting your ideas, getting feedback, learning how to use that feedback to improve, and then over time learning how to give feedback yourself. Right? Some of you, if your teams have group meetings, you might still be very quiet right now, very timid, afraid to kind of share. But hopefully over time, as you learn, as people give you feedback and you learn how to use it, you feel more comfortable giving feedback to others, right? Participating in that process of peer review. Okay, sorry, I was trying to stave off a cough there. All right, so one of the other pieces that you should be aware of as a student too, right, is what we call IP or intellectual property and data management. So again, keep in mind that whoever funds the research actually owns the research. So if your mentor has a federal grant, technically the federal government owns the research. And we've seen instances in the past where literally the state sheriff's office has to come to a space and commandeer lab notebooks and documentation and other things because there were concerns about misconduct from that funded research. If your mentor is funded by the university, supported by the university owns a portion of that intellectual property. I tell you that as undergraduates only to make sure that before you present anything at the Summer Research Symposium, before you would be like, oh, hey, I want to submit to the Journal of Young Investigators and get my work published, or I want to submit to Ethel. You need to have a conversation with your mentor, the person who has some ownership in that intellectual property, to make sure that what you're doing is consistent with the data management and ownership rights. Okay? So I've seen it with undergraduates. They get really enthusiastic. They want to submit to another conference. They want to publish their work. And I just want to encourage you to make sure that you're engaging your mentor in those conversations before, right? Ask for permission, not forgiveness, okay? In these kinds of settings, because there may be things that you're not aware of. And also, if your mentor is also bugging you all the time about, like, make sure you're writing that down, make sure you're recording that, make sure you put your raw data in there as well as your final graph, understand that, right, it's because there's somebody else that could audit that. It's also likely that whatever project that you're going to work on, you're going to hand off to somebody else, right? We oftentimes don't complete research projects with undergraduates in a short time frame, right? And so you're handing off to somebody else, right? And maybe you inherited somebody else's work. If they don't record things well, or if it's not clearly written, right, it's extremely difficult to continue that work, to pick up where it's left off, and to not make mistakes. So be thinking about how you manage your data and record things. So the last slide before we go into case studies is I want you to know if you have concerns. If you see something in your space and you're like, this does not make me feel good. I do not feel like this is consistent with what I heard from Dr. Barton. I'm uncomfortable in this situation. There are resources here at the university to support you. Okay? And the person that you need to know is Dr. Martins, who is in the Office of Research Protections and Integrity, or ORPI, here at UNC Charlotte. So Dr. Martins is the RIO, or the Research Integrity Officer. And so if you do have a concern, right, you have the opportunity to go to ORPI, talk to somebody, express your concern. You can do that initially anonymously. You can just ask questions. You can give feedback like, this didn't feel right to me. Is there really something I need to be worried about, or am I just anxious? And maybe they'll make you feel a lot better about it after that conversation. You're not automatically triggering some, crazy reporting thing or anything like that. But if you do see something and you do know that something is wrong, right? Maybe you're the person who catches the postdoc spiking the samples at the end to get the data they want, right? You do have some responsibility for the integrity of the research enterprise to speak up. And while the ORPI and the RIO cannot entirely protect you, right? Understanding that, right, there's a violation, but then retribution to reporting a violation is a second violation. Okay? As a former IACUP chair who had to deal with this, believe me, it's not fun, but it can escalate quickly in terms of the university's response, right? When somebody reports something and then that person yells at the person who reported it, and it's a second violation, right? They get involved really fast. So if you'd like more resources, I really encourage you to check out the website. If you have any concerns, really encourage you to always, schedule an appointment and talk to somebody. Either get yourself to feel better, get your questions answered, or you could choose to start an inquiry process if you really have a concern. Right? So know that these resources are there to support you throughout this process. Certainly OUR is there as well. If you have concerns about the mentoring environment, things like that, you can always talk to Dr. Powell and myself, right? We can help you. We coach students all the time, coach mentors all the time, right, and trying to help make sure that this is a conducive learning environment. Okay, so we have about 20 minutes left, so I'm going to give you about 10 minutes. I'm going to put you in some groups, and I'm going to give out some case studies, right? I have tried to pick a set of case studies that have at least some relevance to undergraduates, or maybe you can kind of imagine as an undergraduate that you might encounter this situation. But I will admit that it is kind of hard to find case study resources for undergraduates because a lot of this is focused on the graduate student or postdoc or faculty level. But I'm going to pass out some of these case studies. I'd like to give you a chance to read them, and then each case study, some of them it's on the back, some of them it's on the front. There's some questions, some guiding questions for you to kind of talk through. And then in the last 5 minutes or so, let's just kind of bounce around the different groups and really quickly hear a summary of what you guys talked about.